Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeobiking. At the time this video is airing, it will be the anniversary of when the American Civil War began, which is April 12th, 1861 CE. So, with that anniversary in mind, I decided it was time to do uh, a very special video series on a subject that is very much linked with the Civil War and is a byproduct of the American Civil War. The lost cause myth. Uh, with my first video being the lost cause myth and the Civil War in Georgia. And actually, this will be part of a three-part series that I am doing within the month of April. With this video, with all three videos in focusing on the lost cause myth in Georgia, with this video being the most comprehensive uh, and most broad, while the other two being more narrow focused on specific subjects and parts of the lost cause myth. In addition to this, I'm doing this video as part of a collaboration with a Civil War historian uh, whose uh, social media handle is Historicus Magnus. Uh, he is going to, also on the 12th, uh, upload onto his blog a an article talking about the Lost Cause myth and its relationship to the Confederate surrender at the end of the American Civil War at the Appomattox Courthouse. And I will include a link to his blog uh, in the description to this video so that you can go and check that out. Um, and when that article is out, I will also, come back and switch that link for the link to said art. So, with that out of the way, uh, let's get in and start talking about the video. So right off the bat, before we get into the movie, there's an immediate broad content warning for the entire video. I'm choosing now to do this because this will things that are mentioned in the content warning will come up multiple times in the video. Um, so I will not have time every time to warn people. So with that in mind, the content warning is that one, there will be disturbing content discussed within the video involving rape, sexual assault, and other similar acts, as well as the fact that racist phrases and words will occasionally be used when reading primary source documents. This will be a very primary source document heavy video. Um, so unfortunately, because I will be reading those primary source documents, there will be a lot of very racist and outdated language within these documents that I will have to read. Um, and so, with that, with that within your minds, it is important to note that the language used in these cases does not reflect my views or the beliefs of myself, the person making the video, and I am only reading these words in the context of the primary documents, which are, of course, only being read for educational purposes. All right, so with that out of the way, first we need to sort of define a term, um, and that is the lost cause myth. I'm sure a lot of people within the South have heard about the lost cause, and I'm sure a lot of people in the North have heard about both the lost cause and the lost cause myth, but maybe they don't necessarily know like exactly what all of this encompasses. So the lost cause myth is based around the lost cause, which is a romanticized and basically completely inaccurate interpretation of the American Civil War developed by white Southerners after the conflict that downplays the role of African chattel slavery and portrays the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, as fighting for, quote, states' rights and a noble cause. The core ideas within this myth include things like that the Civil War was again primarily fought about states' rights, not African chattel slavery. That the Confederacy was fighting for a just cause and its leaders were heroic. That African chattel slavery was a benign institution and enslaved people were happy and content. And that the Union victory was due to superior resources and numbers and not military prowess. Now, to be fair, this is one of those cases where it's not completely untrue because the United States did have more soldiers and better resources and more numerous resources, but there was also definitely an element of military prowess uh, that allowed the United States to win the war as well. And then finally, the Lost Cause has had a lasting impact on Southern culture and American popular memory, influencing how the Civil War in the South are remembered and commemorated. And here are some good sources on what the Lost Cause is and how it was developed. This is, of course, by no means an exhaustive list, and I will have more sources, uh, cited in the description in my sources list of the video. But this is a good start. And now, in terms of Georgia, the Lost Cause is very much heavily present in Georgia. Civil War monuments, specifically, are located throughout the South, including the state of Georgia, and are heavily connected with the Lost Cause myth. For example, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, Civil War monument in the state of Georgia is Stone Mountain, which is oftentimes equated to Mount Rushmore, where on the side of Stone Mountain was carved the images of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, sort of the three primary mythological heroes of the American Civil War. Not the only ones, and we'll get to some of those other people in a little bit, but these are definitely like the most revered individuals. And then this is just a Confederate memorial from a town near where I live. All right, so with that out of the way, we first need to discuss a subject that oftentimes is overlooked when talking about the American Civil War, or at least um, like only given the bare minimum attention to, and that is the antebellum South. So, what is the antebellum South? The antebellum South is a period in the history of the southern United States that extended from the conclusion of the War of 1812. You could argue a little bit earlier to 1800, but generally the beginning date is around 1815 CE ish, at the end of the War of 1812 CE, and then up until the start of the American Civil War in 1861 CE. This was an area that was marked by the prevalent practice of African chattel slavery and the associated norms that it cultivated. Over the course of this period, Southern leaders underwent a transformation in their perspective on African chattel slavery. Initially, they regarded it as sort of an awkward temporary institution, though not really, but that's a subject for another video. um, but then it gradually evolved into a defended concept, with proponents arguing for its positive merits while simultaneously vehemently opposing the burgeoning abolitionist movement. And here's some right here, some good sources on the antebellum South. Uh, Again, these are by no means exhaustive, but they are a good start. During the antebellum South, cotton was the primary cash crop. King cotton is often how it was referred, and uh, enslaved African Americans would be forced to work for long hours within cotton fields, picking the cotton, as you can see here and here, as well as in the previous slide. Um, and then in the process of doing picking the cotton, these enslaved African Americans would be submitted to horrific treatment because African chattel slavery was absolutely a brutal institution where any minor offense would result in a brutal punishment, if not death, with brutal punishments including things like being tied up to a stick and beaten with a paddle, sometimes with holes or studs or spikes in it, or the most well known, lashing or whipping, as you see here. And oftentimes, another form of punishment, brutal punishment, would be the white American enslavers would force other enslaved African Americans to perform the lashing as a way of control and sort of instilling a sense of melancholy, dread, sadness, whatever, however you want to describe it, just a way to sort of keep everyone in fear and under control. And of course, lashing was incredibly horrific and damaging, as seen in this picture here with this individual, where all of these scars here are the results of lashings. And a further way that African chattel slavery was horrible is that entire families would be sold apart, mothers would be sold away from their children, husbands from their wives, etc., etc. Uh, and behind all of this, while all of this was going on, white American enslavers would begin to use Bible verses to justify enslaving African Americans. With some of the favorite Bible verses used by enslavers, including Genesis 10, uh, chapters 18 through 27, and you can pause to read, as well as the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, uh, ch chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. And I just now realized that this is actually verses 18 through 27. And this information is actually this is a very well studied phenomenon, with multiple books being written on this, such as Noah's Curse, The Biblical Justification of American Slavery by Stephen R. Haynes, and The Origins of Pro-Slavery Christianity by Charles F. Irons. I highly recommend people who are watching this video find these books and read them, as well as other related books. Now, with that with that in mind, it is important to note that religion was not just being used to justify African chattel slavery. In fact, it was also being used to condemn African chattel slavery by abolitionists, with individuals such as Miss Maria W. Stewart stating that it appeared to her that America had become like a great city of Babylon, for she has boasted in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow, I shall see no sorrow. She is indeed a seller of slaves and the souls of men. She has made the Africans drunk with the wine of her fornication, and she has put them completely beneath her feet, and she means to keep them there. Her right hand supports the reins of government, and her left hand the will of power, and she is determined to not let her go her grasp. So you can see in this quote um, that this is very much using religion to show how African chattel slavery has essentially is essentially a great sin within the United States, and has turned the United States into a den of sin and corruption in it, etc. And a similar quote comes from William Lloyd Garrison, a very prominent abolitionist, um, in several of his newspapers and such, where for example, quotes, I confess my early and large indebtedness to him for enabling me to apprehend with irresistible clearness the inherent sinfulness of slavery under all circumstances and its utter incompatibility with the spirit and precepts of Christianity. So, very clear that religion was indeed being used uh, in conjunction with it being religion being used by white American enslavers to justify African chattel slavery. It was also being used by abolitionists to condemn African chattel slavery. Another thing that's very important to point out is just how important and integral um, the institution of African chattel slavery was to the culture and economy of the South. which is something that, much like the law, the antebellum South itself, oftentimes gets I don't want to say overlooked, but it gets the bare minimum attention paid to it. So, with that in mind, I have brought an excerpt from a letter from Savannah physician Richard D. Arnold to Reverend Chandler Robbins explaining the importance of African chattel slavery to the South. And the excerpt reads, and I quote, "The abolitionists of whom I am happy to hear you disclaim of being one have by their intemperance united the whole South against them as one man. To carry their plans into effect, they would have to wade knee deep in blood. I speak the language of truth, not of hyperbole. The two races are so separated that the one now the lower will never be allowed to mount to perfect equality except over the prostrate bodies of the upper. But I will not be led away into any discussion. I will only observe with you that slavery is an abstract question. With us, it involves life, property, safety, and security. Its abstract right I do not argue for, but it's not always good sense or prudence to apply mere abstract ideas to all aspects of social life. And the institution of slavery, although indefensible on the ground of rights, can be defended and well defended upon this, that so intimately it is mingled with our social conditions. So deeply has it taken root that it would be impossible to eradicate without upturning the foundations of that condition. On the ground of expediency, we are still stronger, for without a population of blacks, the whole southern country would become a desert. So, as you can see in this excerpt alone, and this is not the first primary document I'm going to be reading throughout this video that will talk about this, how important African child slavery was to the South. And within this document alone, you can see that African chattel slavery was incredibly important to the South. It was something that they were absolutely unwilling to give up. And here's the source that I got this excerpt from. All right, now this brings us to our next uh, section, the road to the American Civil War, starting with the Mexican American War. So during the Mexican American War, Pennsylvania politician David Wilmot would propose the Wilmot Proviso, which proposed the prohibition of African chattel slavery south of the Missouri Compromise line and any future territory gained by the United States, including territory gained in the Mexican American War. And he presented this in 1846 CE. Um, and the Wilmot Proviso would be supported by most Northern politicians, though not all, and would anger most Southern politicians and citizens. Georgia politicians who would often vote against the proviso included Democrat Representative Howell Cobb, Whig Representative Alexander Stephens, and Whig Representatives Alexander Stephens and Robert Toombs. And you can see that here in the Journal of the House of Representatives of the 29th Congress. And right here, it talks about the Wilmot Proviso being presented and what it was about. And you can see all the people who began to vote against it. For example, if you look in here, you can see Alexander Stephens right away. Uh, and then you can see within these people like Hal Cobb, as well as Alexander Stephens and Robert Toombs. And you can see them in this list as well here. Not only that, many Georgia newspapers would call for, in response to this, and also before the Wilmot Proviso was proposed, would call for African chattel slavery to be admitted into the newly acquired territory. For example, you have the Federal Union in Milledgeville, Georgia, specifically the issue from October 3rd, 1848 CE, which talked about slavery being admitted into the territory, and in fact went out of its way, again going back to the religion, to talk about how the Bible, as you can see here, um, uh, agreed with slavery and how the Bible actually promoted African chattel slavery, with them going on to say, quote, if then by the laws of nature and the natures of God's ordained slavery, how can you say it depends upon municipal law alone? Again, showing that they were very much believed it was their right and were very much unwilling to not allow the spread of African chattel slavery and not willing to give it up. Then you also have the Southern Recorder, also from Milledgeville, specifically the issue from August 1st, 1848 CE, which talked about how one claimed that anyone who talked about the horrors of African child slavery was, quote, misinformed and ignorant. And then they went on to say that they, quote, do not ask you to say that slavery shall or may exist in the territory. Uh, we just ask that we may be permitted to go there with them, which is sort of like you're not asking to say that they're allowed, but you're asking to say that they can go there with them. I mean, that's kind of the same thing. And then you also have the Georgia Telegraph from Macon, Georgia, specifically the issue from September 5th, 1848 CE, which says things like, uh, the United States Constitution recognizes African chattel slavery in the territories, and it should protect the slaveholders in possession of the enslaver in possession of his property, and that if Congress is allowed to decide whether or not African chattel slavery can spread into territories, uh, so should the states and the enslavers have the authority as well. And not only that, Georgia newspapers began calling for the election of an enslaver president, which was specifically in response to the 1848 CE election, where it was between Zachary Taylor and Lewis Cass. And Lewis Cass was described, as well as Bill Moore and other candidates, were described as being one supporters of the Wilmot Proviso, but also as abolitionists. Meanwhile, Zachary Taylor was viewed as an enslaver, and it was believed that by people in the South, including in Georgia, that he should be the president because he was an enslaver. And then we have the Compromise of 1850 CE, which was presented by Whig Representative Henry Clay and Northern Democrat Representative Stephen A. Douglas. Again, remember I said a little bit earlier, not all Northern politicians were for the Wilmot Proviso. And both these individuals would design the initial bill that would become the Compromise of 1850 CE. Obviously, because at the time it wasn't called the Compromise of 1850 CE. The provisions of the compromise included the approval of California's request to enter the United States as a free state. It provided provision to strengthen fugitive slave laws with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 CE. It provided provision banning the slave trade in Washington, D.C., while while still allowing African chattel slavery itself to stay there. Um, it provided provision defining the northern and western borders of Texas while establishing a territorial government for the territory of New Mexico, with no restrictions whatsoever on whether any future state from this territory would be a free state or a slave state. And it provided provision for the establishment of a territorial government for the territory of Utah, again, with no restrictions whatsoever on whether any future state from this territory would be a free state or a slave state. And here are some of the sources I got that information from. And of course, it is unsurprising that most Northern politicians, again, not all, remember Stephen A. Douglas was a Northern politician, but most Northern politicians were against the compromise, while most Southern politicians, including those in Georgia, supported the compromise and the protection of the institution of African chattel slavery. In fact, we have several excerpts of letters by Georgia politicians explaining their views on African chattel slavery. For example, we have this letter here. This is actually the complete letter from Alexander Stevens to James Thomas in the House of Representatives, with the letter being sent on February 13th, 1850 CE, where it reads, quote, "Dear Thomas, we have no news here at the time of interest or importance. At this time of interest or importance. What is to be the result of the slavery question, I cannot tell. I suppose, however, that some adjustment of it will be made, some adjustment of it for the present. But when I look to the future and consider the cause of the existing sectional discontent and their extent and nature, I must confess that I see very little prospect of future peace and quiet in the public mind upon the subject. Whether a separation of the Union and the organization and establishment of a Southern Confederacy would give final and ultimate security to the form of society as it exists with us, I am not prepared to say. I have no doubt if we had unity, virtue, intelligence, and patriotism in all our councils, such an experiment might succeed. But unfortunately for our country at this time, we have, if I am not mistaken, too much demagogism and too little statesmanship. Most of the fighting resolves of our legislatures, I fear, are nothing but a gascon put forth by partisan leaders for partisan effect. If our people really mean to fight, if their minds are made up, this alternative, they should say so, and they should make the declaration in Congress too plain to admit of equivocal readings. But if they do not intend to resort to the ultima ratio of all nations, they should cease in that sort of braggadocio, which will end in the result, which in result in their own degradation. But enough. I did not commence this with any intention of giving you a dissertation on the present crisis of public affairs. Then we have an excerpt from the letter. Actually, I think this is also the full letter from Hiram Warner to Hal Cobb of Greenville County, Georgia, sent on March 17th, 1850 CE. That reads, and I quote, "Dear Sir, although I'm no politician, I am very reluctantly obtrude myself upon your attention for the purpose of making a single suggestion in relation to the slavery question in which we all feel a deep and abiding interest. The Nashville Convention is supposed will meet in June. I see that it has been stated that all action by Congress in relation to the settlement of that question will probably be deferred until the meeting of that convention. My own opinion is that the question had better be settled before that convention meets, if it can be, for several reasons. That convention may not be unanimous as the proper course to be pursued, and then the South will be present a divided front, a divided a front and weaken its moral force. If they should be unanimous, composed as I fear it may be of ultra politicians who have nothing to lose but everything to gain by secession or more properly speaking, revolution, they may resolve to take such ultra grounds for a settlement of the difficulty as the people of the non-slave holding states cannot sanction. And besides, it will look like like dictation on the part of Southern states, and the North may refuse on that account. Whereas nothing of that kind can operate upon them if the question is settled before the convention meets, to say nothing of everlasting claim, which certain individuals might suppose they would have upon the slaveholders of the South by having the question settled by what they would consider the action of the convention, when according to my judgment, if the question can be settled at all, it can be as well settled without the convention as with it. Now, if the North intends to settle this question and to give the South equal rights in the common territory of the Union, she will settle on the basis of the Missouri Compromise line. And with that, I shall be content, and the people of the Southern states will be content in my judgment. What the Southern people want, I mean the real stakeholders, is the right to take their slave property into the common territory of the South, territory south of that line, and enjoy it without disturbance. In that proposition, there is something just and tangible. And if that right should be refused by the North, our people can be rallied to fight up that line. And then we have this is actually an excerpt. Uh, we have an excerpt of a letter from Thomas R. Cobb to Hal Cobb in Milledgeville, Georgia, on May 7th, 1850 CE, that reads, and I quote, "Dear brother, there is nothing passing within knowledge in the political world in your district worth your attention. The people are for the Union and will sustain you in any honest effort to compromise honorably the question. My own feeling is that the abolition of the slave trade in the district is not only allowable but desirable. The only fear is to make the people understand that the question when these demagogues cry out abolition, the good-hearted and honest will be with you. Unfortunately, their voice is seldom raised and never heard. I speak this question as I see it rumored, and that is included in the proposition of the Compromise Committee." And here is the source that I got all of these quotes from. But as you can see, the spread of African chattel slavery was very much at the forefront of the issues of the people of all Southern citizens as well as Southern politicians, including in Georgia. And eventually, the Compromise of 1850 CE would be passed by the United States Congress on September 9th, 1850 CE. And here is a map of sort of what happened as a result of said compromise. Uh, Uh, with that being said, the issue of African chattel slavery and attempts to halt its spread would lead Southern politicians such as Alexander Stephens to break away from the Whig Party. Um, and in Georgia, he would then go on to join Southern Democrat politicians such as Hal Cobb and Jeremiah Clemens to form the Constitutional Union Party. And the Constitutional Union Party would nominate Daniel Webster to run for president and Charles J. Jenkins to run as vice president in the election of 1852 CE. However, Webster would die on October 24th, 1852 CE, 9 days before the election. As a result, the Constitutional Union Party would dissolve and would be absorbed by the Southern Democrats. And as a result of that, a new Democrat nominee would be chosen in the form of Franklin Pierce, who would actually go on to win the presidential election of 1852 CE. And then we have the Kansas Nebraska Act, which was yet another bill created and introduced to Congress by Northern Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, who created the bill wanting to create new territories, specifically Kansas and Nebraska, as the name implies, to develop and facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad. To win the support of Southerners, Douglas would go on to agree to repeal the Missouri Compromise, with the status of African chattel slavery instead being based on, quote, popular sovereignty, where under popular sovereignty, the citizens of each territory, rather than Congress, would be able to determine whether African chattel slavery would be allowed in the new territories. And he would present this bill between January 4th and May. I was not able to find a specific date in May, but between January 4th and May 1854 CE. And unsurprisingly, basically all Southern citizens and politicians, including Georgia politicians, supported the act, while most Northern politicians opposed the act. And we can again see examples of this in excerpts of letters uh, within the letters of Georgia politicians that explain their views on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. For example, in what I believe is the full letter, but may also be the excerpt of a letter from Robert Toombs to W. Burwell, which was sent within the U.S. Senate chamber on February 3rd, 1854 CE, reads, and I quote, "My dear sir, I thank you for your reply to my dispatch and letter this morning. I have some servants and horses in Charleston waiting for the ball. Steamer and I am anxious to know when she will resume her trips in order to give instructions to my agents uh, touching their movements. I feel great solicitude about your course on the Nebraska bill. We had a caucus this morning of the Friends of the Bill. Every Southern Whig senator for the bill and every Southern Democrat whose opinions are also known for it. The meeting was composed of a large majority of the Senate who unanimously determined to carry the bill as it stands on the slavery issue. There cannot be a doubt as the propriety and policy of repealing the Missouri Compromise. The North never did agree to it and never would sanction it since its adoption. They have adhered to its prohibitory provisions, but uniformly and nearly unanimously trampled its principles underfoot so far as the South was to be benefited by it. The measure was originally passed by Southern votes, with a few Northern men, every one of whom were defeated by voting for it but three. When the territory of Oregon was organized with the prohibition in it, the North unanimously refused to accept the prohibition with the recognition of the Missouri Compromise. In the long struggle for the governments for California and New Mexico, the whole North, with I think but four exceptions, repudiated and refused to recognize the Missouri Compromise. And even today, the free soil scoundrels who talk of the breach of compact repudiate it in principle, which was division on a line of latitude, and insist only on the prohibition. In sustaining it, they only sustain the Wilmot Proviso. Therefore, the North having both refused to adopt or recognize it, there is no pretense that it is or was a compact between the sections. But the Compromise of 1850 was a compact recognized by a majority of the North and adopted by both parties, North and South, in their party platforms. Has therefore the almost universal sanction of the nation, and the Nebraska bill but applies its principles to the present and all other cases for the future. This will settle it in conformity with the declared will of the whole people, and offer only the possible mode of final disposition of this dangerous question. It is a measure of peace, equality, and fraternity. And if we let this opportunity of finally settling it escape, I see no hope in the future. Dissolution will surely come, and that speedily. I write hastily under the speech of Mr. Chase. When you next come to the city, call on me, and we will talk over the matter more fully than I have time to write. And then we have this excerpt of a letter from Alexander Stevens to W. W. Burwell in Washington, D.C., sent to Washington, D.C. On May 7th, 1854 CE, that reads, and I quote, Dear Sir, your letter was duly received, and I feel obliged to you for it. Your lick on Benton was appropriate and was well calculated to lessen the effect of his speech with his old party. His speech, by the by, is very valuable in many points. Tomorrow, I think we shall get the Nebraska bill up in committee. The contest will be hard and the vote close, but we have the count. How the result will be, I cannot positively state. Anything that you might feel disposed to say favorably to the measure will be very timely this week. Perhaps Franklin might be induced not to vote against the bill if he should be assured that the sentiments of the people of Maryland were for it. I feel a deep interest in the success of the measure as a Southern man. The issue presented by the bill is one which, in the main, has arrayed free soilers in solid ranks against the South. The moral effect of the victory on our side will have a permanent effect on the public mind, whether any positive advantages accrue by way of the actual extension of slavery or not. The effect of such a victory at this time is important. We are on the eve of much greater issues, in my opinion. And here are all the sources. Here's the source for all those quotes that I just read. And much like with the Wilmot Proviso, many Georgia newspapers would write articles supporting the Kansas Nebraska Act. such as the Southern Banner from Athens, Georgia, specifically the issue from January 19th, 1854 CE, which talks at length about Douglas's Nebraska bill and talks about the spread of African chattel slavery into the territory, and how it requires universal attention and needs no commotion from them, um, among other things, and how it secures the to every citizen an alienable right to move into any of the territories with his property, which is of course enslaved African Americans, and to hold and enjoy the same under the sanction of the law. And then you have the Southern Recorder from Milledgeville, Georgia, specifically the issue from May 30th, 1854 CE, which talks about the Nebraska bill as well as its removal of and repeal of the Missouri Compromise, with this issue specifically saying the South has on the stand quietly and firmly upon its fundamental principles, and has quieted the threatening and noisy vaporings of northern agitators, and that those vaporings will speedily subside. And then it shows all the politicians who voted in favor of said bill. And then we have the Southern Banner from Athens, Georgia, specifically the issue from July 20th, 1854 CE, which again talks about the importance of the Nebraska Bill and the spreading of African chattel slavery to the territory, such as saying that Southern men are more deeply interested in the soundness of a national party upon the slavery question than upon any and all other issues. Um, and that they boldly express an approval of the Nebraska and Kansas bill on the question of leaving the people thereof to say whether or not they will have slavery as part of their domestic institutions. So, as you can see through all of that, yet again, much like the Compromise of 1850 and the Wilmot Proviso, in the South and in the state of Georgia, within the South, uh, the protection of the institution of African chattel slavery and its spread to other territories was very much the most important issue within the South. And of course, much like the Compromise of 1850, due to the support of Southern politicians and Southern citizens, the Kansas Nebraska Act would be passed on May 30th, 1854 CE. Which leads us to Bleeding Kansas. After the passing of the Kansas Nebraska Act, pro African chattel slavery raiders known as border ruffians would cross into the Kansas territory from Missouri to help ensure the territory entered the United States as a slave state, specifically beginning to enter the Kansas territory around November 1854 CE. Then the following year, also after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, Northern abolitionists known as Free Staters, also known as Free Soilers, who were led by John Brown, would be led into the Kansas territory in an effort to make the territory a free state, with John Brown and the Free Staters, Free Soilers, entering the territory around sometime in the spring of 1855 CE. And this is actually one of their sort of flyers that they would hang up and pass around, trying to make sure Kansas did not become a slave state and did not admit African chattel slavery into the territory. Then, right around this time and concurrent with all of this, uh, on March 20th, 1854 CE, the Whig Party would sort of dissolve, and the Republican Party would replace the Whig Party as the dominant Northern political party, with the Republican Party being built around, at least to some degree, around anti-slavery. And I want to make a quick distinction. There is a difference between anti-slavery and abolition. Abolitionists were for the complete and immediate um, uh, like outlawing of African chattel slavery, whereas anti-slavery is had various tenets such as like say gradual emancipation or shipping off African Americans to Africa, which did happen to some degree in the form of the African nation of Liberia. Uh, then, going back to the Kansas Territory, with the entrance of the Free Staters slash Free Soilers and the Border Ruffians, the Kansas Territory would become divided into two hostile camps: the pro-African Chattel Slavery forces and the Free Stater forces, led by John Brown. And this would lead to a series of violent confrontations breaking out in the territory between the two factions that would go on to become known as Bleeding Kansas, and this would happen between 1855 and 1861 CE. And of course, the fate of the Kansas Territory would become a key concern of Southern politicians, which you can again see in the letters of Georgia politicians, which explain their views on Kansas. For example, we have the letter from Thomas W. Thomas to Alexander Stevens, sent to Elberton, Georgia, on February 25th, 1856 CE, that reads, and I quote, "Dear Sir, your request on behalf of Mr. Thornton concerning the corn shall be attended to. Last Friday I got a letter from you dated to the 30th of January. It was written in reply to mine reminding you to send documents to Dr. Hearn. How it was detained so long on the road I cannot imagine. I see Shannon's appointment has been confirmed by the Senate and that he has gone back to Kansas. I read the announcement with none of the pain of disappointment, but on the contrary, with a sense of relief. The position was full of responsibility, and while I did not intend to shun it, mature reflection since you first mentioned the matter had taught me not to covet it. If Kansas comes in as a free state, the Kansas Party at the South, the true Southern Rights Party, of which I consider you and Toombs to head and the head and front, will go down. The masses on this, as on all subjects, will take no test of reliability, soundness, and good policy except success. Integrity, courage, and sense defeated become trickery, cowardice, and folly. This has been the case in all ages and will be to the end of the chapter. Expectation has been excited. Our enemies at home have charged that the measure was a free soil measure, that foreigners would rush in and defend the South. It will be in vain that we say improve the status was anti-slavery, that the repeal gave us at least a chance. They will bring up their prophecies, and the result and all the reasoning and the truth in the world cannot withstand the effect that will be made on the popular mind. I verily believe the effect will be the utter prostration of every man at the South who has stood up for us, and the complete triumph of a set of traitors and fools. If the question could be decided this summer and the anti-slavery party prevails in the territory, I believe Kenneth Rayner would beat Pierce for president. It was with my mind fully impressed with these views that I had resolved to accept the appointment, fully conscious that while success would have elevated me immensely, defeat would crush me and the cause of slavery within me. Or, sorry, cause of slavery with me. You can easily imagine, therefore, that it is not unpleasant to think I shall not be called on to hazard so much. These are my opinions. I am fixed and settled in the belief that the next 12 months will show I am right. To one who has observed the signs of the times for the last 6 months, it seems to me it ought to be plain that this struggle in Kansas is the very turning point of the battle between the North and the South, which has raged for 35 years. Of all men in the country, the President is the most interested to have the cause of slavery prevail in that new state. He has cast in his lot with the South, and he must sink or swim with us. So far as I am personally concerned, I am perfectly satisfied with the turn of events have taken, and under the lasting obligations to you for the confidence and high opinion you have manifested for me. Do you intend to come home to any of the spring courts? And when is it likely I shall see you? And then we have the letter from Hal Codd to Alexander Stevens, sent to Washington, D.C., Washington City, on September 19th, 1857 CE, that reads, and I quote, Dear Stevens, I suppose that you have received my letter in answer to your last, in which I gave you what Whitfield had to say about Kansas. I reply at once to yours of 16th. And I quote, and this is a quotation within the letter, quoting, I can add nothing to my last about the condition of things in Kansas, for we have heard nothing more. The adjournment of their convention until next month is not understood here, and we are at a loss to account for it. We shall probably hear in a few days on that point, and I will write you if it is of any importance. In reference to the pamphlet about Kansas, I have seen hastily read portions of it. It contains palpable misstatements as well as false arguments. The statement that Walker's inaugural was submitted to and approved by the president and his cabinet is untrue. We saw it until it was published in the papers after Walker got to Kansas. I think I have said as much to you before. The argument of the pamphlet on the Badger Amendment is wholly at war with our construction of the Kansas bill. I might refer to the other points, but it is necessary. The author attempted to get the idea that it was semi-official, which was repudiated by the Union, the states, and other people, and other papers. Upon the other point of your letter, which looks to the contingency of the convention refusing to submit the Constitution to the people for ratification, I frankly confess that it is full of difficulty. I have thought much about it and said but little. With all my heart, I trust that such an issue will not come upon us. I am not authorized to say what course the administration will pursue. We have not anticipated it and have not made program. My own individual opinion is that it will produce the most dangerous crisis we have yet had on the Kansas question. And the quote ends here, and the letter continues, I know your argument. I have read it and thoroughly studied it, but the reply can be made with overwhelming power that the refusal to submit was the result alone of a fear that a majority would condemn it. I tell you that an effort to get a free state in the Union over the will of the majority of its citizens would never be supported at the South. But I do not invite a discussion of a question which I trust in God will not arise. In the frankness and confidence of your correspondence, I throw out the above question, which I have before made in some of my letters to you. I have written this hasty reply that it may go by return mail. Let me hear from you how the canvass goes. Jones of the C and S professes to look for the election of Hill. I suppose it is a mere brag. And then we have the letter from Joseph E. Brown to Alexander Stevens, sent to Milledgeville, Georgia, on March 26th, 1858 CE, that reads, and I quote, Dear Sir, I have the pleasure to acknowledge the receipt of your 19th letter. I very much regret to learn that there is now great doubt of the admission of Kansas with the Lecompton Constitution. I thank you for your kindness in giving me the true state of things there in reference to this question. If Kansas is rejected by a direct vote, I can see no other course for Georgia to take but to stand by her rights upon her platform and act or confess to the world that she has backed down from her solemn pledges. I should feel that our humiliation was deep and painful should we adopt the latter course. If Kansas is rejected by the indirect mode which you mentioned of smothering the bill in its long agonies in the select committee room, our position will be still more embarrassing. Would this not amount to a rejection? And could we doubt that the existence of slavery in it? The Constitution was the cause of the rejection. There might be, however, uh, there might, however, be difficulty in uniting our people or obtaining a majority for action in this latter event.
I confess I do not see how I could consistently, with my official duty, neglect to call the convention in case Kansas is rejected in the one as the other way. The statute is imperative unless she is rejected on other grounds than the existence of slavery in her constitution. If Minnesota and Oregon are admitted with free constitutions and Kansas was rejected, what will the people say was the region? It was the reason. I know this is a grave question and requires the most serious and cautious consideration. I hope to do nothing rashly. I am sure you do not wish me to shrink from the discharge of any duty. I would with great pleasure hear the advice of our distinguished senators and representatives in Congress as you suggest. I cannot doubt their determination to preserve the honor of Georgia unsustained. What assurance have I that some of them would refuse their advice and leave to act without it? Would the united delegation respond to the call? The call of the convention might create confusion in Georgia. Its meeting would not necessarily involve separate state action. It might be proper to adopt ordinances to take effect so as a majority of the southern states concurred. I know you will do all in your power to guide us safely through the difficulty. I shall thank you for the information of the state of things as often as you have time to give it. And again, here is the source that I got all of these quotes from. And much like the Wilmot Proviso and the Kansas Nebraska bill, Georgia newspapers would write about the importance of the Kansas Territory becoming a slave state, such as the Federal Union in Milledgeville, Georgia, specifically the issue from June 12th, 1855 CE, that would talk about spreading African chattel slavery to Kansas. For example, in this episode here, they sympathize with the Friends of the Slavery cause in Kansas and their manly efforts to maintain their rights and the rights and interests of Southern people, um, and that they have found patriotic men who have thus stood by the rights of the South and judging of their nature. And then there's also the Southern Banner from Athens, Georgia, specifically the issue from May 29th, 1856 CE, that talks about the war, the sort of border war and guerrilla war going on between the border ruffians and the free soilers, uh, with them stating that perhaps a civil war was on the rise and that the fanatics of the North are responsible to God, the country, and the world for this. And then while all this was happening, there was also a very famous court decision made, specifically the Dred Scott decision, where the Dred Scott decision happened, where after an individual by the name of an enslaved African American individual by the name of Dred Scott was moved from Missouri to Illinois with his enslaver, which was Illinois being a free state. Dred Scott would go on to sue his enslaver for freedom multiple times, with Scott arguing that his residence in free territories and free states with his enslaver made him free, with all these court cases happening between April 6th, 1846 CE and March 6th, 1857 CE. And then eventually the Supreme Court would make its decision, deciding that, and ruling that Scott, as an enslaved person, was not a citizen and therefore could not sue in federal court. And the court also ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that Congress lacks the authority to prohibit African chattel slavery in territories, with this final decision being made on March 6, 1857 CE. And here's some copies of that decision here. Uh, and unsurprisingly, many Southern newspapers, including those in Georgia, would write articles praising the Dred Scott decision. For example, the Georgia Telegraph from Macon, Georgia, specifically the March 17th, 1857 issue, uh, talked about the Supreme Court decision and said it was a triumph for the South as well as for truth and justice. and saying other things that uh, they will boldly and successfully assail the motley agitators and make strong appeal of the law-abiding sentiment of their people, and that the decision was admittedly bound to awaken the highest state of Black Republican effervescence uh, that has been seen since the passage of the Nebraska Bill. And then there came the election of Abraham Lincoln, where Abraham Lincoln became the Republican presidential candidate on May 10th, 1860 CE. And during this time, due to Lincoln's anti slavery views, albeit rather tepid anti slavery views, but by no means was he as moderate as a lot of people tend to think they are. For that, I recommend people reference my video I did. I and my friend, who's a U.S. historian, Ryan Dennison, did on the Civil War that I will link in the iCard. But anyways, due to Lincoln's anti-slavery views, Southern citizens would begin talking of disunion upon the election of Lincoln and a Republican administration. For example, Georgia newspapers would write of disunion upon the election of Lincoln, such as the Daily Columbus Times from Columbus, Georgia, specifically the October 16th, 1860 CE issue uh, that talks about, again, the election of Lincoln, and stating that if a Republican president gets elected, um, there was no prospect for the South, uh, for a single state going in the South going for Lincoln, um, and that Republican parties are aiming to subvert the Constitution, and there is a danger in yielding to every aggression and compromise of their rights. But uh, despite these statements that if Lincoln won the presidential election, the South would separate from the United States. Abraham would go on to win the election of 1860 CE. And then, as a result of Lincoln winning the presidential election of 1860 CE, on January 19th, 1861 CE, Georgia would secede from the United States. And they would state very clearly in their Declaration of Secession that African chattel slavery um, was at the forefront of the reason that they seceded. In fact, I have several excerpts from that declaration. And I say excerpts because it's a rather long document, so I did not have time to include the entire document. But excerpt one reads, and I quote, "The people of Georgia have dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America. Present to their Confederates and the world the causes, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states. Uh, with reference to the subject of African slavery. They have endeavored to weaken our security, to disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, persistently refuse to comply with their express constitutional obligations to us in reference to that property, and by the use of their power in the federal government have striven to deprive us of an equal enjoyment of the common territories of the Republic. This hostile policy of our Confederates has been pursued with every circumstance of aggravation which could arouse the passions and excite the hatred of our people, and has placed the two sections of the Union for many years past in the condition of virtual civil war. Our people, still attached to the Union from habit and national traditions, and averse to change, hoped for that time and reason an argument would bring, if not redress, at least exemption from further insults, injuries, and dangers. Recent events have fully dissipated all such hopes and demonstrated the necessity of separation. Our Northern Confederates, after full and calm hearing of all the facts, after fair warning of our purposes not to submit to the rule of the authors of these wrongs and injuries, have by a large majority, committed the government of the United States into their hands. The people of Georgia, after an equally full and fair and deliberate hearing of the case, have declared with equal firmness that they shall not rule over them. A brief history of the rise, progress, and policy of anti-slavery and the political organization into whose hands the administration of the federal government has been committed will fully justify the pronounced verdict of the people of Georgia. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party, under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. While it attracts itself by its creed, the scattered advocates of exploded political heresies, of condemned theories in political economy, the advocates of commercial restrictions of protection, of special privileges, of waste and corruption in the administration of government, anti-slavery in its mission and in its purpose. By anti-slavery, it is made a power in the state. The question of slavery was the great difficulty in the way of the formation of the Constitution. Excerpt 2 reads, and I quote, "The faithless conduct of our adversaries is not confined to such acts as might aggrandize themselves or their section of the Union. They are content if they can only injure us. The Constitution declares that persons charged with crimes in one state and fleeing to another shall be delivered upon the demand of the executive authority of the state from which they may flee, or to be tried in the jurisdiction where the crime was committed. It would appear difficult to employ language freer from ambiguity, yet above 20 years the non-slaveholding states generally have wholly refused to deliver upon us persons charged with crimes affecting slave property. Our Confederates, with Punic faith, shield and give sanction to all criminals who seek to deprive us of this property, who use it to destroy us. This clause of the Constitution has no other sanction than their good faith that is withheld from us. We are remediless in the Union. Out of it we are remitted to the laws of the nations. A similar provision of the Constitution requires them to surrender fugitives from labor. This provision and the one last referred to were our main inducements for confederating with the Northern states. Without them, it is historically true that we would have rejected the Constitution. In the fourth year of the Republic Congress passed a law to give full vigor and efficiency to this important provision. This act depended to a considerable degree upon the local magistrates in the several states for its efficiency. The non-slaveholding states generally repealed all laws intended to aid the execution of that act and imposed penalties upon those citizens whose loyalty to the Constitution and their oaths might induce them to discharge their duty. Congress then passed the Act of 1850, providing for the complete execution of this duty by federal officers. This law, which their own bad faith rendered absolutely indispensable for the protection of constitutional rights, was instantly met with ferocious revilings and all conceivable modes of hostility. And then excerpt 3 reads, "These are sound and just principles, which have received the approbation of just men in all countries and in all centuries. But they are wholly disregarded by the people of the northern states and the federal government. Uh, it is impotent. And the federal government is impotent to maintain them. For 20 years past, the abolitionists and their allies in the northern states have been engaged in constant efforts to subvert our institutions and to excite insurrection and servile war among us. They have sent emissaries among us for the accomplishment of these purposes. Some of these efforts have received the public sanction of the majority of the leading men of the Republican Party in the national councils, the same men who are now proposed as our rulers. The efforts have, in one instance, led to the actual invasion of one of these slave-holding states, and those of the murderers, incendiaries who escaped public justice by flight have found fraternal protection among our Northern Confederates. So, as you can see, just from those three excerpts alone, from again a rather long document, that the primary reason that Georgia seceded from the United States and joined the Confederate States of America, who we'll talk about in a second, was to protect the institution of African chattel slavery. And here's the source that I got this from. And then, after the secession in February 8th, 1861 CE, Georgia would become a member of the Confederate States of America. And with that, on February 11th, 1861 CE, Georgia politician Alexander Stephens would become the vice president of the said Confederate States of America. And he would give a cornerstone speech, a very famous cornerstone speech in Savannah, Georgia on March 21st, 1861 CE. And the excerpt, and that quote reads, but not one but not to be tedious in enumerating the numerous changes for the better, allow me to allude to one other, though last not least. The new Constitution has put to at rest forever all agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our former civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rapture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would be split. He was right. What was the conjecture with him? uh, what was conjecture with him is now realized fact. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially and morally and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or the other, in the order of providence, the institution would be effervescent and pass away. This idea, though not incorporated in the Constitution, was the prevailing idea at the time. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly urged against the constitutional guarantees thus secured, because the common sentiment of the day, because of the common sentiment of the day, those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of all races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation. The government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Uh, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, this is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development. Like all other truths in the various departments of science, it has been so even amongst us. Many who hear me perhaps can recollect well that this was not generally admitted even within their day. The errors of the past generation still clung to many as late as 20 years ago. Those at the nation who still cling to these errors with zeal above knowledge, we justly denominate fanatics. All fanaticism springs from an aberration of the mind, from a defect in reasoning. It is a species of insanity. One of the most striking characteristics of insanity in many instances is forming correct conclusions from fancied or erroneous premises. So, with all the anti slavery fanatics, their conclusions are right if their premises were. They assume the Negro is equal, hence conclude that he is entitled to equal privileges and rights with the white man. If their premises were correct, their conclusions would be logical and just, but their premise being wrong, their whole argument fails. If I recollect, once having heard a gentleman of from one northern state of great power and ability announce in the House of Representatives with imposing effect that we of the South would be compelled ultimately to yield upon this subject of slavery, that it was as impossible to war successfully against a principle in politics as it was in physics and mechanics. That the principle would ultimately prevail. That we, in maintaining slavery as it exists with us, were warring against a principle founded in nature, the principle of equality of men. The reply I made to him was that upon his grounds we should ultimately succeed, and that he and his associates in this crusade against our institutions would ultimately fail. The truth announced that it was as important to war successfully against a principle in politics as it was in physics and mechanics and mechanics. I admitted, but told him that it was he and those acting with him who were warring against a principle. They would attempt to make things equal, which the Creator had made unequal. And so, as you can see in Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech, in the minds of the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, and the state of Georgia, uh, slavery was in the defense and protection of African chattel slavery was the primary and arguably the sole reason. It was the sole reason. Let's just say that it was the sole reason uh, for Georgia and the Confederacy to secede in the Confederate States to secede from the United States. And again, let's just get this out of the way. It was the sole reason because all the other sort of subsets of reasons that we could argue, like say the economy and other things, all lead back to African chattel slavery. And here's the source that I got this from here. And then on April 12th and April 13th, 1861 CE, the Confederacy would attack the United States Fort Sumter in South Carolina, officially beginning the American Civil War. Which now brings me to the next few sections, which are addressing the importance of African chattel slavery within the American Civil War itself. Now, from this point forward, I do want to say that, uh, as you've seen in this previous video, all of my sources that I have used have been from Georgia politicians and Georgia newspapers. In these next few sections, I did try to maintain that pattern and try to continue to use Georgia sources. However, in some cases, I did have to fall back to sources not from Georgia, not from Georgia soldiers or officers and such. Um, because unfortunately that's just the nature of the game. Some statements were, made by people like say in Alabama or Virginia, while some were made by people in Georgia. So just keep that in mind. All right, with that out of the way, now we look at the Confederate soldiers and the question of African chattel slavery. Uh, for one thing, right off the bat, Confederate soldiers fought to defend the institution of African chattel slavery. That is not up for debate. And we have this evidenced by excerpts from letters of Confederate soldiers and speeches made to Confederate soldiers. For example, we have an excerpt from a letter from William M. McKee, a private in the 18th Regiment Georgia Infantry, to his wife Elizabeth McKee, sent on sometime in September 1861 CE, that reads, and I quote, I would like the best kind to have been home today and spent some time in telling you the curiosity I have seen. It is most 3 months since I left home, and to bound out all the time is intolerable, is tolerable bad. But to think of home and all present hours I have spent is worse than all. The season fruit is almost gone, and the beautiful spring has passed away, but I haven't enjoyed any of them. But we will be rewarded for all our trouble and disappointment. We will enjoy liberty, and nothing is worth anything without it. It is better to live on meat and bread for a few months and all in years than lose all property, character, and everything that makes a man happy. For no man can be happy without liberty, and if we can't have liberty, I never want to go home. It is liberty or death with me. I love home and all that surrounds it as well as anybody, but if I have to be equal to a nigger, I had rather never come home. Better fall in the struggle for it. So for one thing, again, apologies for using the very racist term. Um, but another thing, as you can see right here in this letter, it was very defending African chattel slavery and making sure white Americans remain at the top of of the racial hierarchy was absolutely paramount. And then we have an excerpt from a sermon given by Bishop Stephen Elliott to Georgia citizens and soldiers in 1862 CE that reads, and I quote, what shall we think then of the relation which subsists between a dominant race, professing to believe in God and to acknowledge Christ, and a subject race, brought from their distant homes, placed under its charge for culture, for elevation, for salvation, while so placed, contributing by its labor to the welfare and comfort of the world? What a trust from God! What reliance has He placed upon our faithfulness and our integrity? What sure confidence does it give us in His protection and favor? His divine arrangements are placed in our keeping. Will He not preserve them? His divine purposes seem to have intermingled with our success. Will He not be careful to give us that success? And just in what way He shall see to be for best for us? His purposes are yea and amen in Jesus Christ, and cannot be overturned by man. It places our welfare above any estimate which is unspiritual minds can make of it. While many other motives are urging, yeah, it is warfare. Places our warfare above any estimate which unspiritual minds can make of it. While many other motives are urging us to the battlefield, we rush forward to defend our liberties, our homes, and our altars. God is super adding this other motive, the secret of His own will, is making it to produce within us unconsciously, perhaps, to ourselves, a power which is irresistible. Our conscience in this war is thus made right towards God and towards man. Our heart is filled with His fear and His love. Our arm is nerved with almost superhuman strength, and we have reason to thank Him not only for what He has done for us, but for what He has restrained us from doing for ourselves and others from doing for us. This noble cause has made Him our guide and our overruling governor, and we are moving forward, as I firmly believe, is truly under this direction, as did the people of Israel when He led them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. So, as you can see from this excerpt, in the minds of Southern priests and bishops, including in Georgia, and in the minds of Southerners and Georgians as a whole, the American Civil War was a holy war brought that they started to defend their God-given, air quotes, right to African chattel slavery and their right to the dominance of the white race. And here's the source that I got that excerpt from. And then we have an excerpt from of a letter from Reverend James Sinclair, Colonel of the 35th Regiment of North Carolina, to John W. Ellis, sent on May 4th, 1861 CE, that reads, and I quote, In making this offer, I ask for nothing but an opportunity, even in the humblest capacity, to vindicate the honor, the integrity, and sovereignty of North Carolina. Whatever may best, in your judgment, promote the public good and the triumph of the cause in which we are engaged. There place me, and let results vindicate my faithfulness and fidelity to my country and its interests. There is a peculiar propriety in ministers of the gospel. I think at this time, in coming to the aid of the executive, vital principles of morality and religion underlie the question at issue in the present struggle. If we are not time servers and dishonest men, we must show not only the fanatics of the North, but also our own people, that we have not followed cunningly devised fables, that we have taught our people certain principles and doctrines in relation to the institution of slavery. We are now prepared with our lives and fortunes to endorse the same. This, I think, will give to our troops that esprit corps, which rendered our revolutionary heroes and the Covenanters of Scotland invincible in their day and immortal in ours. And again, we see in this excerpt, source, this excerpt, that in the eyes uh, of Southerners and the Confederacy, the war to protect African chattel slavery was a holy one. Now, this brings us to our next section, which is actually connected to the previous one. It's connected to all of them, but is really mostly connected to, in most ways, connected to the previous one, and that is race, class, in the Confederate Army. So, society in the antebellum South and in the South during the American Civil War was built around a class system and a strict race divide. You could also argue that this still exists in the modern South. But for the purposes of this video, at the time of the antebellum South and in the South during the American Civil War, this is the class divide that existed, which was broadly made up of enslaved African Americans at the bottom, and then in some cases, in some periods of the American South, you had indentured servants, but generally you had poor whites above enslaved African Americans, and then you had yeoman farmers who were landowners, and then you had enslavers who were the aristocrats who were the wealthiest and owned the most land. Uh, and of course, they were the smallest of the, in population of the various social and classes within the South. And much like they wanted to protect African chattel slavery, the citizens of the South wanted to also protect and keep in place that class system. And we can see that in the letters and journal entries of Confederate soldiers. For example, we have in this excerpt of a letter from Georgia Captain Eugenitus Allen to his wife that was sent on August 14th, 1861 CE, that reads, and I quote, I received your letter by Lieutenant Waller today. I anticipated his concern and did not write you Sunday. He gives us an idea how things are in Old Troop, their previous military unit. Many are very encouraging, some are not. He says that some of the boys have written back that they are at one time had nothing to eat for 48 hours, and if they ever get home, they would never leave it and were treated worse than Negroes, etc. Shame upon anyone that would make such statements. The righteous contempt of the whole company falls upon their deserving heads. It is an old adage that some men would grumble to be hung. The greatest disaffectants have always been men of no social standing. Those who fare here was better than they provided themselves at home. So you can see in this excerpt of this letter um, the sheer contempt that the upper class of the South had for the lower classes of the South, and how, and if it suited them, they would very much compare them to enslaved African Americans. And then we can see a further example of the importance of this class system, specifically the wanting the wealth that comes with being a member of the upper classes, the upper echelons of this class system, as well as the importance of African chattel slavery in a diary entry made on September 19th, 1863 CE by a sharpshooter in the Georgia Army by the name of William Montgomery, who stated that after a hard march from Atlanta, that he would, quote, give a small Negro to get some rest. And here's that source that I got that quote from. And then another key part, a very key way that African chattel slavery was important to the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, as well as the Confederate Army, was the impressment of enslaved African American labor in the Confederate Army. And this is because enslaved African Americans were forced to provide labor to build and repair forts and railroads, as well as to act as ditch diggers. And we can see this in statements by Confederate soldiers, in this case specifically Georgia soldiers, uh, who talk about the use of enslaved African Americans as laborers. For example, in a letter to the Confederate higher ups, the Confederate government, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer stated that, quote, patriotic planters have provided the Army with a large force of slaves, making this letter on January 19th, 1861 CE. And then at Fort Pulaski, Georgia Private Augustus Adamson stated uh, in a letter to the Confederate government that Brigadier General Alexander Lawton could have quote could have had 500 Negroes fortifying the fort, but he chose otherwise to do so. But he chose otherwise with poor results, with him making this letter on April 12th, 1862 CE, um, shortly after Fort Pulaski had been captured by the United States Navy. And here are the sources that I got these quotes from. And then there was also the reliance of enslaved African Americans in Confederate Army camps, where specifically the Confederate Army relied heavily on enslaved African Americans to perform daily tasks in the camps, such as acting as nursemaids, uh, cooks, etc. And again, we can see the importance of Confederate laborers to the Confederate Army in the personal accounts of Confederate soldiers. For example, in a letter sent to his sister while stationed in Georgia, Arkansas Captain Alex Spence stated that to quote to his sister, quote, "Be certain to send me a Negro boy. A Negro, I think, is safer in the Army than anywhere else." Uh, we can again see this in a letter sent by South Carolina First Lieutenant John B. Grimble, who wrote to his father that, quote, "In a fort, a servant is very important as he performs the various duties of chambermaid, butler, and bootblack." With him sending this letter uh, on September 27th, 1862 CE. And then we have a letter by North Carolina Second Lieutenant Charles S. Powell that was sent who wrote in his memoir, while stationed in Georgia, that, quote, "A young mulatto often returns from searching the countryside laden with delicacies such as milk, butter, light bread, buttered sausage, backbones, and even dried fruit, honey, and preserves." Then we come to the subject of enslaved African Americans fleeing the Confederacy and enslavement for the United States, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation and Confederate hunts for runaway enslaved African Americans. So early in the war, several United States generals would free enslaved African Americans, especially along the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Meanwhile, many enslaved African Americans would flee plantations to United States occupied territory, with all this starting around 1862 CE. And this was something that was very much enraged the South and citizens of the South, which can be seen in statements by Confederate soldiers, such as a statement in a letter sent by Alabama Sergeant Edwin H. Fay, where he stated, quote, "The Yankees should pay for every Negro stolen during the war." Uh, which with him sending this letter on August 2nd, 1862 CE. And then we can see it in a statement in a letter sent by Georgia Brigadier General Clement A. Evans, uh, where he states, quote, "The United States Army is doing a regular Negro stealing business on the coast," with him sending this letter to his wife on November 13th, 1861 CE. And here are the sources that I got that information from. Then Lincoln would sign and create the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved African Americans in the Confederate States of America were to be freed. Um, it's important to note that distinction because he did not initially free enslaved African Americans in the United States. And he initially created the bill on September 22nd, 1862 CE, with the bill officially going into effect the act going into effect on January 1st, 1863 CE. And of course, much like the previous freeing of enslaved African Americans by the United States Army, and the fleeing of uh, enslaved African Americans to United States occupied territory, the Emancipation Proclamation would make Confederate citizens furious, where we can again see this in statements by Confederate soldiers on the Emancipation Proclamation, such as in a letter written by Louisiana Captain E. John Ellis, who wrote to his wife that, quote, "Lincoln and the Negroes alone would be free. The North is only enslaving itself. Will her people stand while the bolts are fastened and the chains riveted, which must bind them into slavery?" With him sending this letter on December 12th, 1862 CE. And then we can see it again in a letter to his wife by Virginia Brigadier General Henry A. Wise, who proclaimed in this letter, quote, "Curse the Lincoln Proclamation," with him sending this letter on October 6th, 1862 CE. And here are the sources I got that information from. Uh, Now, because of the previous running away of enslaved African Americans and the previous freeing of enslaved African Americans by the United States, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, during military campaigns, the Confederate Army would conduct several large scale, quote, slave hunts to capture runaway enslaved African Americans. For example, during the Shenandoah Valley campaign, Virginia Lieutenant General Stonewall Jackson's forces would capture many runaway enslaved African Americans. There is no exact number given, but this campaign happened between March and June of 1862 CE. And we can see an example of this happening in an excerpt from a diary entry of um, William Lyle Wilson, a Virginia private participating in Jackson's Shenandoah campaign, where he states, quote, "Constantly you met troops marching back with prisoners, some with two or three, sometimes with dozens. Many Negroes were also taken while trying to escape with the Yankees." And he made this entry in his diary on May 25th, 1862 CE. And here's the source I got that from. And then during the Maryland campaign, which is the campaign that the Battle of Antietam happened in, the Confederate Army would again conduct slave hunts. And with this campaign happening between September 4th and 20th, 1862 CE. And this event is actually reported in a United States political magazine known as Harper's Weekly, a journal of civilization, where it would describe and depict Confederate soldiers driving captured African Americans uh, 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 during an earlier, quote, slave hunt in the Maryland campaign, uh, where they talk about, for example, the rebels in Secessia are barely engaged just now and running off to Richmond and beyond Negroes and conscripts. A Union man just found from below Culpeper says that he saw droves of Negroes and white men on the road at different points, all strongly guarded, and he does not exactly know which excited his pity most, the white or the black. Um, so there is that, and this is the depiction of that event here. The biggest of these quote slave hunts actually happened during the Gettysburg campaign when the general of the Army of Northern Virginia, the supreme commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, ordered much of his army to conduct a slave hunt. With Lee's army capturing several hundred runaway enslaved African Americans. Again, no, there's no exact number given. This happened between June 3rd and July 24th, 1863 CE. And there are actually several eyewitness accounts, firsthand accounts of the Gettysburg slave hunt. For example, in Greencastle, Pennsylvania, the town councilman Charles Hartman observed Virginia Brigadier General Albert G. Jenkins and his cavalry scouring nearby fields for American residents, stating that, quote, many of them were caught after a desperate chase and being fired at. Uh, and then in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Rachel Cormany watched in horror as Jenkins' uh, cavalrymen seized many of her African American neighbors, with her stating that, quote, that she, quote, retired at 11 o'clock. All was quiet, so we concluded that all those reports must be untrue about the Rebs being so near, or that they had struck off in some direction. Mr. Plow took his horse away so as to be on the safe side. So Annie and I were all alone. At 11 and a half, I heard a clattering of horse hooves. I hopped out of bed and ran to the front window. Sure enough, there the graybacks were, going by as fast as their horses could take them, down to the diamond. Next, I heard the report of a gun. Then they came back faster, if possible, than they came in. But a short time after, the whole body came, the front ones with their hands on their gun triggers, ready to fire, calling out as they passed along that they would lay the town in ashes if fired on again. It took a long time for all to pass, but I could not judge how many there were, not being accustomed to seeing troops in such a body. At 2 o'clock a.m., all was quiet again, save an occasional Reb riding past. We went to bed again and slept soundly until 5 in the morning. All seemed quiet. We almost came to the conclusion that the Rebs had left again, leaving only a small guard who took things quite leisurely. Soon, however, they became more active. They were hunting up the contrabands and driving them off in droves. Oh, how it grated on our hearts to have to sit quietly and look at such brutal deeds. I saw no men among the contrabands, all women and children. Some of the colored people who were raised here were taken along. I sat on the front step as they were driven by, just like we would drive cattle. Some laughed and seemed not to care, but nearly all hung their heads. One woman was pleading wonderfully with her driver for her children, but all the sympathy she received from him was a rough march along, at which she would quicken her pace again. It is a query what they want with those little babies. Whole families were taken. Of course, when their mother was taken, she would take her children. I suppose the men left thinking the women and children would not be disturbed. I cannot describe all the scenes now noon. The rebel horses, with just enough men to take care of them, and their teams have just passed through town again on the retreat. Wonder what all this means. Just now, the news came that the dismounted Rebs are drawn up in line of battle out at McClure's and expect a fight. So they sent their horses to the safe side of town in case a retreat is necessary. Some are walking and riding by every few minutes. Horses and wagons were taken back again. Evening, had a good sleep this PM. So had Pussy. and will retire trusting in God for safety. And she made this account in her diary on June 16th, 1863 CE. And then we have an account from the Philip Schaff diary, specifically Dr. Philip Schaff, who was one of the theologians in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, um, where he states that Virginia Captain John H. McNeil and a group of mounted Southerners, quote, on Friday, this guerrilla band came to town on a regular slave hunt, which presented the worst spectacle I ever saw in this war. They proclaimed first that they would burn down every house which harbored a fugitive slave, and did not deliver him up within 20 minutes, and then commenced the search upon all the houses on which suspicion rested. It was a rainy afternoon. They succeeded in capturing several contrabands, among them a woman with two little children, a most pitiful sight, sufficient to settle the slavery question for every humane mind. Saturday the 27th, early in the morning, the guerrilla band returned from their camping ground and drove their booty horses, cattle, yeah, from the camping ground, drove their booty horses, cattle, about 500 sheep, and two wagons full of store goods with 21 Negroes through town and towards Greencastle or Hagerstown. It was a sight as sad and mournful as the slave hunt of yesterday. They claimed all these Negroes as Virginia slaves, but I was positively assured that two or three were born and raised These uh, in this neighborhood. One, Sam Brooks, split many a cord of wood for me. There were among them women and young children, sitting with sad countenances on stolen store boxes. I asked one of the riders guarding the wagon, "Do you feel bad and mean in such an occupation?" He boldly replied, he felt very comfortable. They were only reclaiming their property, which we had stolen and harbored. And he made this entry into his diary on June 25th, from June 25th and June 27th, 1863 CE. And then we have a letter from a Confederate soldier named Chester K. Leach, who was a second lieutenant, or from a United States soldier, uh, who is Chester K. Leach, who was the second lieutenant of the Second Vermont Infantry of the United States Army, who observed that, quote, I saw a sight yesterday that beats all I ever saw. A Negro boy that the rebels left in a barn entirely naked. His breast and his bowels were scratched and cut, and the doctor said that turpentine had been put on him, and all his privates had been cut off. I went into the barn to see him, but it was rather dark. He lay on his back, his legs bent, knees up, grating his teeth, frothing at the mouth, and seemed to take no notice of anything. His breast and his bowels looked as though they had been cut then burned all over. I understood the reason of the act to be because he would not go over the river with them. And this entry was this letter uh, this letter to his wife was sent on July 15th, 1863 CE. And then we have an order sent by G. Moxley Sorrell, the staffer of South Carolina Major General James Longstreet, to Virginia Major General George Pickett of Pickett's Charge fame, where he instructed Pickett to march east and reminded him that, quote, the captured contrabands had better be brought along with you for further disposition. And here's the source I got that from here. Now this brings us to our next section. And this is not necessarily looking at the African chattel slavery part of the lost cause. This is looking at another part of the lost cause that is very much connected to the African chattel slavery lost cause. As well as the Civil War, and that is the idea of the United States Army being butchers. Um, and of course, and while that's a very common myth, it ignores the fact that the Confederate Army also practiced what is known as total war and also committed atrocities specifically against African American soldiers. And where this myth generally comes from is the idea that is the fact that General William Tecumseh Sherman, United States General William Tecumseh Sherman, is mythologized by the South as a horrific butcher due to the tactics he used in the Atlanta campaign. And I do want to state, I'm not trying to justify Sherman's tactics in the Atlanta campaign. Um, I sort of understand why it happened, because in his eyes, the war needed to be ended quickly. Uh, but again, that doesn't necessarily make them okay. It sort of makes you understand why he did what he did, right? Whether it's right or wrong in a war, and especially in a war that had been going on for so long. Um, is not an easy question to answer. That being said, the important thing is that the tactics he used were not unique to him or the United States. In fact, Confederate generals developed similar tactics years before the Atlanta campaign, with the most egregious one being Stonewall Jackson, who is accounted in a biography about him written by a Confederate general. Written by a Confederate general in 1906. Stonewall Jackson is stated to have come up with a plan that said, quote, the Confederate Army should cross into the upper Potomac, occupy Baltimore, and take possession of Maryland, and we could cut off the communication of Washington, force the Confederate government to abandon the capitals, beat McClellan's army if it came out against us in the open country, destroy industrial establishments wherever we find them, break up the lines of interior commercial intercourse, close the coal mines, seize and, if necessary, destroy manufactories and the commerce of Philadelphia and other large cities within our reach, take and hold the narrow neck of the country between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, subsist mainly on the country we traverse, and make unrelenting war amidst their homes, force the people of the North to understand what it will cost them to hold the South in the Union at bayonet's point. So, as you can see in this biography uh, uh, about Stonewall Jackson, written by Confederate soldiers, Stonewall Jackson very much was, came up with a plan that's almost exactly like the plan that William Tecumseh Sherman would use years later. So again, Stonewall Jackson came up with a plan that is a carbon copy of Sherman's plan, tactics in the Atlanta campaign years before Sherman actually did the Atlanta campaign. So one could argue that Sherman's tactics were carbon copy, though in all fairness and reality, Sherman probably just independently came up with the same tactics because humans be humans, and we come up with similar ideas separately. But it doesn't just stop there because there are multiple instances of the Confederate Army committing brutal atrocities and massacres against African American soldiers. For example, the most infamous of these being the massacre of 221 mostly African American soldiers at the Battle of Fort Pillow on April 12th, 1864 CE, by a Confederate army led by Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the founders of the KKK. And we can see the brutality of this massacre in accounts by Confederate soldiers, such as a letter from one of Forrest's sergeants, Achilles V. Clark, who wrote to his sister on April 14th, 1864 CE, that, quote, our men were so exasperated by the Yankees' threats of no quarter that they gave but little. The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall on their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy. But they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. The white men fared but little better. The fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. Blood Human blood stood about in pools, and brains could have been gathered up in any quantity. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs, and carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of blood, and the firing ceased. So, to this individual's credit, Achilles B. Clark, he was horrified by this massacre. However, that was not always the case. For example, a an African American soldier who survived the massacre said that one Confederate private told him to that quote, all the colored boys that can escape had best do so by all means, for General Forrest is going to burn or whip them to death after they got further south. With this African American soldier saying that this happened on April 18th, 1864 CE. And here are the sources here. And then there was a shortly after this, on April 18th, 1864 CE, there was a Confederate Army massacred 300 United States soldiers, including 117 African American soldiers at the Battle of Poison Springs. This was in Arkansas. Uh, and we can see the brutality of this massacre in Confederate accounts, such as a journal account by Arkansas Brigadier General who stated Brigadier General William L. Cable, who stated that quote the number of killed of the enemy was very great, especially among the Negroes. And then you had an account written in a diary, the diary of Choctaw Colonel Tandy Walker, who stated that, quote, my men were motivated at the thought of shedding the blood of their despised enemy. And then you have the account in a diary of Texas Colonel Charles de Morse, who stated that, quote, few prisoners were brought in by my command. And here's that source here. And then the bloodiest of these massacres of African American soldiers by the Confederacy actually happened under the command of General of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Supreme Commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, as well as under the command of Virginia Major General William Mahone, who ordered the 64th Regiment of Georgia Infantry, as well as elements of the Army of Northern Virginia, to massacre 423 African American soldiers at what became known as the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864 CE. And the brutality of the Battle of the Crater can be seen in again in the accounts of Confederate soldiers, such as a letter sent by James Paul Verdery, a private in the 48th Georgia Infantry, who wrote to his sister that during the battle, the Georgia soldiers would not retreat in the face of quote niggers. Again, I apologize for using the racial language niggers, as fast as they came over, the bayonet was plunged through their hearts, and the muzzle of our guns was put on their temples and their brains blown out. He then continues to write that after the battle, quote, the ground in the center was invisible to the eye, owing to the many dead and dying blacks piled upon one another. Well, dear sister, I have witnessed a truly bloody sight, a perfect massacre, nearly a black flight. And he wrote this letter to his sister on July 31st, 1864 CE. Now this brings us to our concluding thoughts. So, why is the lost cause a myth? Well, for one thing, African chattel slavery was integral to the South's economy, societal structure, and culture, and white American settlers made it very clear early in the 1800s and really before that they would rather die or fight than abolish the institution. The issues over the continuation and spread of African chattel slavery was a key issue to the South long before the outbreak of the American Civil War, which can be seen in fierce political debates over the spread of the institution to the newly acquired Mexican territory and bloody border conflicts in the Kansas territory. The primary objection to the election of Abraham Lincoln was his anti slavery stance. The protection of African chattel slavery was stated by Southern citizens, from the politicians to the poor farmers and everyone in between, to be the primary reason for their secession from the United States, for why they seceded from the United States. And they fought the United States in the American Civil War to defend African chattel slavery. African chattel slavery was integral to the Confederate war effort, as enslaved African Americans provided manual labor for the construction of fortifications and railroads and acted as servants who did everyday chores for Confederate soldiers in Confederate army camps. Southern citizens openly stated their anger at the enslaved African Americans fleeing to the United States, as well as the United States Army freeing enslaved African Americans, and most fervently at Lincoln's creation of the Emancipation Proclamation. During during multiple military campaigns, the Confederate Army conducted several large-scale quote slave hunts to capture runaway enslaved African Americans, indicating that the Confederate States of America was willing to use the Southern military as a weapon for race control. Then another important note is that while General Sherman is known as a butcher because of his tactics used in the Atlanta campaign, Sherman's tactics were not unique to the United States Army, as Confederate generals such as Jackson developed similar plans years before Sherman developed his. And furthermore, the Confederate Army enacted brutal, racially motivated massacres of African American soldiers at battles such as the Battle of the Crater and the Battle of Fort Pillow. Taken together, these facts show that the lost cause is nothing more than a myth. And I can understand. I'm sympathetic to people who still believe the lost cause to a degree. Having grown up in the South, um, I was taught lost cause ideology in schools, all the way up until college. And it took a very intelligent, very persistent college professors of history showing me the primary documents. Uh, you know, and explaining the economics and everything to finally get me to realize that, oh, it wasn't over states' rights. And if it was over states' rights, it was over the states' rights to enslave African Americans. So I'm sympathetic to a degree to people who believe in the lost cause, but I'm sorry, it's a myth. It's purely a myth, not built in fact at all. So I do apologize, but there's nothing more than I can to say other than here it is. And as I said at the beginning of the video, this is part of a collaboration with a friend of mine, Jonathan, whose uh, social media handle is Historicus Magnus, who is going to post a blog about the lost cause. Uh, make an article about the lost cause on his blog, and I will include a link to his blog in the description. And this is again also going to be one of three videos that I'm doing for the month of April, all involved with the lost cause. This is going to be the longest and most comprehensive one. The other two are going to be more compact. So look forward to watching those as well. And if you would like to see me cover any of the things I discussed in this video in greater detail in other videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.